Ferrari secured a solid podium finish at the Red Bull Ring in Spielberg with Charles Leclerc and a fourth place with Lewis Hamilton. This result, in the context of the Austrian Grand Prix, provided the Maranello team a much-needed breath of fresh air. The race was strong during the final two-thirds, but was hampered by imperfect thermal management in the first stint. Most of the gap to the McLaren cars was accumulated after 27 laps due to the need to manage the brakes. McLaren, on the other hand, was unaffected by temperature issues. Once again, the Ferrari SF-25 cars were forced into repeated lift and coast. In the first stint, Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc lost 0.5 and 0.7 seconds respectively to the leading cars, also slowed down by continuous lift and coast instructions from the pit wall. One of the car's limits came from the front end, with the seven-time Formula One world champion particularly showing a clear lack of rotation in medium-speed corners. The British driver suffered from understeer that later turned into oversteer on corner exit. The Ferrari drivers struggled in the latter part of the first stint, suffering more from tire degradation, while the McLarens pushed hard and gained time. Oscar Piastri immediately pressured his teammate at the front, showcasing the true level of the MCL39. Ferrari, however, was betrayed by the high track temperatures close to 50 degrees Celsius, which increased thermal wear on the rear tires. Moreover, heat radiation from the track surface made managing heat between the engine and brakes difficult. This forced both drivers to lift earlier before the end of the straights in order to slow the car, using engine braking first, then applying the brakes. This technique reduced the braking power needed to slow the car and consequently lowered the heat generated. On the other hand, Oscar Piastri managed his tires better than his McLaren teammate, closing part of the gap built up after the first stint. The Australian Championship leader asked the team to delay his first pit stop to avoid getting too close to his teammate and better manage temperatures. Based on the telemetry related to the degradation data, Oscar Piastri gained a tire advantage during the early part of the stint. This situation led to a bigger drop in performance for him toward the end. George Russell had an unremarkable race, again showing how the Brackley car struggles with high temperatures. The British driver lost over a second per lap at times, with very inconsistent pace. Undoubtedly, a race to review for the German team. In the final part of the Austrian Grand Prix, Ferrari lost more ground, partly because the Maranello team eased off compared to the McLaren duo. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, fighting for the race victory, again showed superior pace, running about 0.3 faster. Thanks to the lighter car, the McLaren drivers managed temperatures better, suffering very low performance degradation. At Spielberg, the Italian team achieved its best result of the 2025 Formula One season. The improvement requested by the drivers with the new floor arrived, although the gap to McLaren remained significant due to various factors including downforce and tire management. Looking at the race overall, Charles Leclerc lost an average of 0.27 seconds per lap, particularly struggling in the first stint, with an accurate gap of 15 seconds to Lando Norris at that stage. The Italian car's poor thermal management partly comes from a front brake duct unable to dissipate heat effectively. Ferrari deputy team principal Jerome D'Ambrosio, who replaced Frédéric Vasseur this afternoon, also mentioned this. The Italian team will need to work on this issue, as it is not the first time they have been forced into a strategy that ultimately limits the SF-25 car's potential. Overall, it was possibly the dullest race of the year, with the same positions held from start to finish. But this time, at least behind the dominating McLarens, there are two Ferrari cars. That's a satisfaction worth enjoying fully, especially since it might mark the beginning of something. After Ferrari introduced the new floor on the car, performance improved, and many positives were visible during the race at the Red Bull Ring. In fact, halfway through, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton managed laps faster than Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, although the Monegasque eventually finished 19.8 seconds behind and the Briton in fourth, 29 seconds off. Ferrari is still not a winning car, and Charles Leclerc once again complained about missing pace, despite his risks and smart driving style. However, there are signs of awakening, as shown by Mercedes' George Russell, winner of the previous Canadian Grand Prix, finishing more than 40 seconds behind the leading Ferrari. Granted, Max Verstappen was absent after being hit by Kimi Antonelli on the first lap, so Red Bull was missing, but Ferrari still had the consistency to keep the Austro-British car behind. Lando Norris's victory came from mental focus that had not been there before. The Briton usually struggles at the start, but at Zeltweg he was flawless. Around lap 10, a fierce battle erupted with Piastri, who passed him with cold precision. Norris reacted and overtook his teammate, forcing him to give up. Then came a tense moment on lap 20 when Oscar attempted an almost impossible late braking and narrowly avoided colliding with Lando. The team gave a sharp warning to the Australian, who, although closing in on Norris again later, didn't dare to try again. Now, with Piastri leading the championship and Norris chasing, there is a 15-point gap. Nothing is decided. The battle remains open, and these two will keep us on edge starting next Sunday at Silverstone. There are weekends when it is more important to focus on the positives rather than the negatives. For Ferrari, the Austrian Grand Prix was exactly that kind of weekend, as third and fourth place represented a satisfying result, both in terms of outcome and race pace. Of course, if the goal is to match McLaren, there is still much work to be done, and the path remains steep. However, for now, the team must proceed step by step, beginning with consistently outperforming Mercedes and Red Bull, two teams that, throughout the season, have often managed to stay ahead of the Maranello squad. For Mercedes, it turned out to be one of the most difficult weekends of the season, while Red Bull's situation became complicated already during qualifying due to the heat. It reached a point where, even had Max Verstappen completed his final attempt, it would have been unlikely for him to beat the time set by Charles Leclerc. The fact that the Dutch driver was then taken out of contention by Kimi Antonelli further simplified things, but it had already seemed likely that Ferrari would be ahead. In a weekend where it was essential to start evaluating the effectiveness of recent updates and, above all, to get ahead of the other two top teams, Ferrari accomplished its mission. Charles Leclerc secured a strong podium finish, and Lewis Hamilton claimed fourth place in what turned out to be a fairly solitary race for both drivers, given their significant advantage over Mercedes. Jerome D'Ambrosio, Ferrari's deputy team principal who stepped in for Frederic Vasseur after the latter had to leave Austria before the race for personal reasons, emphasized that the key theme of the weekend was the clean execution across all sessions. The Belgian explained to Sky that the team had managed to put the whole weekend together, which was very important both in qualifying and the race. While McLaren had clearly been faster and operating on a different level, he stressed that Ferrari needed to remain focused on itself and continue improving gradually. He also noted that the updates brought to the Austrian round were moving in the right direction. Although a lot of work remains, he echoed Frederic Vasseur's view, expressed since the beginning of the season, that building a solid weekend overall allows the team to work more calmly and move forward effectively. At certain points, Ferrari even matched McLaren's pace. However, as Jerome D'Ambrosio pointed out, the focus should be more on understanding why the McLaren team occasionally reduced their pace, since Ferrari ran a steady and straightforward race strategy. A similar pattern had already been seen at other Grand Prix, such as in Spain, when the Woking-based team only revealed its true potential after feeling pressured by Verstappen. At that point, McLaren quickly pulled away from its rivals, including Ferrari, which had until then seemed to maintain a good pace.